And under pressure, Alan Joyce stepped down effective immediately as Qantas Chief Executive. His departure coming as the corporate regulator, the opposition and the media demand answers over decisions he made as CEO. Vanessa Hudson, the CFO, will now step into the top job from tomorrow. The Fin Review reports that Alan Joyce leaves amid a firestorm engulfing the company over allegations of illegal ticket sales and undue influence over government. In a statement, Alan Joyce said, "In the last few weeks, the focus on Qantas and events of the past make it clear to me that the company needs to move ahead with its renewal as a priority." He said there have been many ups and downs and there is clearly much work still to be done, especially to make sure we always deliver for our customers. The Australian newspaper reports that Richard Goyder, the chairman, and Alan Joyce had a series of discussions over the weekend, with his voluntary exit the culmination of those conversations. Then there was a hastily convened board meeting last night where, according to the Herald, Goyder sought feedback from each director on Joyce's offer to go. He said the overwhelming response was that Joyce's departure was regretful but appropriate in the circumstances. The Qantas board understood the incoming chief executive, Vanessa Hudson, needed clear air to move ahead, but directors were not prepared to push Joyce. It shows just how much control Alan Joyce had over the Qantas board. The Herald's Elizabeth Knight wrote that the chief executive had become, in her words, toxic. She writes that this is not the legacy Joyce would have wished for himself. He would rather be remembered as the person who managed a Herculean turnaround in performance of the airline to produce a record profit nudging $2.5 billion. Well, Joyce has spent 22 years at the airline, 15 as chief executive, but now questions over his golden handshake, reportedly up to $24 million. These details are still to emerge over the next week. And Qantas chairman Richard Goyder is facing questions over Joyce's massive pay package. He's also under pressure over what knowledge Qantas had over the sale of ghost flight tickets. These are tickets to flights that were never going to happen. And then the airline made it extremely difficult for customers to recoup their costs. The airline group was planning to add around $500 million to its bottom line instead of finding ways to repay Australians. The competition watchdog is now taking Qantas to court over these allegations, that it sold thousands of tickets to flights that had already been cancelled. And this legal action by the ACCC is explosive. The Australian's business writer, Eric Johnston, says the allegations made by the ACCC that Qantas was selling airfares for flights it had already cancelled was so serious that they demanded a proportional response. He writes the ACCC action has exposed worrying signs around governance. He says this was the final straw of the cascading brand damage that has now led to Alan Joyce's early departure. Labor Senator Tony Sheldon, who will be on the show later tonight, he says that now that Joyce has gone, there are still serious questions for the chairman and the board to answer. He even went so far as to suggest that perhaps Richard Goyder should step down too.
It is clear that this board and Richard Goyder needs to also be held to account for the decisions that this company has been making over this period of time. The real test for Goyder and the board is that they turn around and make sure that $24 million is clipped. And if that doesn't happen, Richard Goyder should go.
And as I said, Tony Sheldon is coming up later in the show. Goyder is refusing to step down. He says he's fully committed to staying on at Qantas. But journalist Joe Aston made the point last night on the program that when he started raising questions in his columns about Qantas's conduct, Goyder seemed more interested in shutting down his reporting rather than asking questions about what was unfolding, what was going on. Have a look.
The amazing thing to me is that the chairman of Qantas was reading these articles about what was going wrong at Qantas, and instead of saying, maybe we need to look into some of this, he was saying, OK, we've got to shut this down. I mean, that tells you a lot about their mindset.
And part of his move to try and shut it down was going in to see the senior editors at the Australian Financial Review to complain about the reports. And Qantas also removed the Australian Financial Review from its lounges. Well, reacting to the news of Alan Joyce's early departure when it broke today, former Labor Minister Stephen Conroy agreed that the board did still have some crucial questions to answer.
It doesn't resolve some of the very serious issues that Qantas are facing at the moment, the issue around the credits and people's ability to redeem the credits, selling on flights that were never going to take place. I think that is a shock to Australians. And then there's questions around the remuneration of Alan Joyce and whether or not he should receive, I think there's a $4 million short-term bonus. Were the board aware of those potential charges by the ACCC when they allowed him to sell his Qantas shares?
Many questions remain for the Qantas board and two for Anthony Albanese. While he has now admitted to being involved in the Qatar Airways decision and to having conversations with Virgin about it, he denied again today that he'd ever been lobbied by Joyce over his government's decision to block Qatar Airways from having 28 extra flights in and out of Australia. At the time of that decision, Qantas wasn't back to full capacity. There were limited flights, and this all meant that the price of airfares was going up. Virgin has said that had Qatar been allowed the extra flights, the cost of airfares may have come down by about 30%. What has emerged in all of this is a close, cosy relationship between the Prime Minister and the Qantas Chief Executive. Albanese's son holds a membership to the exclusive Chairman's Lounge, while Joyce describes the pair as mates. And have a look at this article from last year. It's headlined, Qantas boss Alan Joyce snubs his own airline to fly Air Force Elbow. And it talks about how Joyce got a lift with the Prime Minister on his private plane to the Jobs and Skills Summit in Canberra. The Herald article states, and I quote, "The luckiest few who attended from Sydney, among them Qantas Chief Executive Alan Joyce and BHP's Mike Henry, even managed to land a seat on the Prime Minister's plane, nicknamed Toto 1, that's after Elbow's dog, to jet them to the capital." It says these fortunate chief executives did have to pay their own way to cover the cost of the flight, though. Then again, our back-of-the-envelope calculations, about $6,400 to fly a KC-30A plane from Sydney to Canberra, and there were about 20 souls aboard, show it would have still been cheaper hitching a ride with Elbow than copping Qantas's inflated rates. Well, again today, the relationship between these so-called mates was causing Albanese a headache in Parliament. Today was Albanese's final question time before he jets off to ASEAN and the G20 on yet another overseas trip. He'll be relieved to fly out of Australia as he faces interrogation over decisions made by his government to the benefit of the airline.
The call to the Chief Opposition Whip.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Did the Prime Minister have any conversations with the outgoing Qantas CEO or any other senior executive of Qantas regarding the Qatar application before the decision was made? If so, on what date or dates?
Give the call to the Prime Minister.
No.